Digital transformation has come a long way with investment in that area projected to reach $4 trillion by 2028, says Frank Della Rosa, Research Vice President of SaaS, Business Platforms and Ecosystems at IDC. He joins host Frank Vitagliano on Beyond Distribution with GTDC to discuss the latest trends in the cloud marketplace and the evolving role of distribution in the cloud ecosystem. How will the digital landscape change in the future? Where will hyperscalers fit in this evolving cloud ecosystem? Check out this episode of Beyond Distribution with GTDC for answers to those questions and even more insight on the global cloud movement from IDC. Thanks for listening.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to our next edition of Beyond Distribution podcast that we've been doing for a few years now. I think this is number 53 or number 54, something like that. I'm delighted today to have with me Frank Della Rosa from IDC. Frank is responsible he's Vice President, SaaS, Business Platforms and Ecosystems. And Frank, those are obviously areas that are pretty significant in the world we live in today. So welcome and thanks for joining.
Thanks, Frank. I'm really pleased to be here.
Yeah, good. So to get started, Frank, what we usually like to do is just tell the listeners maybe a little bit about yourself, how you got into the industry, and also, your role at IDC, because obviously everybody knows IDC, is aware of IDC. A lot of people recognize the partnership that GTDC has had with IDC, but it'd be good to know a little bit more about your specific set of responsibilities.
Sure, I'm happy to do that. So I've been in the industry for quite some time, more than 25 years. And I started in the industry in sales and business development. I'm dating myself here, but I was selling hardware for Group Bull and Zenith Data Systems. And I think I followed the traditional route, which is going from hardware to solutions or hardware to software and solutions. And so left Zenith, went to work for a digital commerce company for a time where I was head of sales and had a team that I was responsible for. We did this during the dot-com period, so it was exciting and nerve-wracking at the same time.
Yep.
But it gave me a very interesting perspective on the industry. The reason that I don't know if I chose research or research chose me, but I decided what I really wanted to do was take my understanding of solution selling and apply that to consulting. So started to do some work in the area of research-based consulting, which as a salesperson, I was always accustomed to researching my customer and researching the challenges and the solutions that we were pursuing. And then being able to expand that to maybe broader research like market research, trends, TAMs, things of that nature. And I started up a small practice myself, working very closely with some other research-based consulting practices. And we were doing a lot of channel work at the time for companies like IBM, Microsoft, Hewlett-Packard. It gave me a great rounded perspective. And then about 8 years ago, maybe a little less now, 7.5 years ago, I came to work for IDC in this role focused on SaaS. And that has since expanded to include business platforms and ecosystems. And my role at IDC is a bit unique in that it's not covering one particular vertical market or one particular set of functional markets. It's looking at these topics across industries, across application categories, and across geographies. So I work closely with an esteemed group of colleagues that tend to go very deep into a particular area, but I guess I'm more focused on trends.
Yeah.
And as you say, this is a very interesting time to be covering these areas.
Yeah, it sure is. And one of the things that I've certainly recognized since I started working extensively with IDC over the last 3 or 4 years is the research that your organization does with the 1,100 analysts or so that are out there is incredible, in terms of its depth and the overall sort of areas that you can get into. So there really isn't an area that you guys don't cover in some way that's pretty significant. So, and I think your role is particularly interesting, more so recently to us, which we'll get into as we talk about some of the things that the distributors are doing, et cetera. But before we get into that, I guess the digital, transformation topic is, well, probably what, the last 4 or 5 years has really been, much discussed, right? And you can't have a conversation about what's going on in IT and not have that discussion. What's your sense of sort of the progress that's being made, and the investments that people are making?
Yeah, it's certainly come a long way. I mean, it's a core part of how businesses stay competitive today and how they stay relevant and future ready. I mean, if you look at our current forecasts, digital transformation investments, they're projected to reach almost $4 trillion by 2028.
Wow.
And that's accounting for about 70% of total ITC spend.
Wow.
So organizations are continuing to invest very heavily in digital transformation, with interestingly hardware accounting for about 45% of total digital transformation investment. And I think now IT budgets are more resilient than in the past. As things have moved more from CapEx to OpEx. But I'd say one of the major shifts or changes is that customers are more thoughtful in how they spend. In the beginning, even if we looked at cloud migration, there was this mass move to take advantage of the cloud. And I think with digital transformation, there was this inertia that in some cases got the best of companies, where it maybe wasn't as planned or wasn't as well thought out simply because there wasn't a history to go back and look at. Now there are enough use cases, enough lessons learned, and enough best practices where companies really are much smarter about their digital transformation investments.
Yeah. Well, I tell you that the one number that surprises me a lot based on what you just went through is 45% hardware still. And I guess that just speaks to the fact that you still need a ton of infrastructure to do what we're doing, right? For folks to make the transition, right? Whether it's to support AI or support cybersecurity requirements, and certainly compute, which, as we all know, isn't going away. But in the overall picture, people kind of just assume that hardware is getting smaller and smaller, but that number, 45%, is certainly smaller than it was, but it's still a big number. I mean, that basically almost 2 trillion, right?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. You think about, the plumbing has to change over time.
Yeah.
And you have a couple of things happening there. The demands on business to be more agile,
yeah,
and to be more flexible. And I think what's really interesting is looking at this from an analyst perspective. Disruption, whether it comes in the form of a global pandemic, or it comes in the form of geopolitical changes, or it comes in the form of innovation, creates new opportunities. And those new opportunities require additional investment to capitalize on. And that starts with the foundational investment, putting the right foundation in place on which to build, and hopefully putting something in place that's enduring and can be modified rather than replaced. So we see this continuing. And as you mentioned, especially with advancements in AI, both generative and agentic.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that I really value, even though my role is predominantly distributor and obviously channels, but what I really value from the work that you guys do is you're talking to the end users. You're talking to the people that are making the decisions to make the investments, and then that is what results in distributors and channel partners, et cetera, being engaged. But until those decisions are made at the end user level, nothing's happening. And that's a very significant thing that people have to think about, as it relates to our overall industry.
You're absolutely right. And going back to disruption, we looked at what was driving a lot of these decisions, and it really was the impact on people. The fact that workforces became much more distributed. You had more remote workers that basically required the same type of access and experience as they were getting in the office. And that drove a lot of the investment to update and upgrade, but with a much shorter window. Things had to happen very quickly to keep businesses operational. And now what we see is you've got a similar kind of situation with AI where there's an impact, huge impact on the workforce.
Yeah.
But on the hiring aspect of it, on the positioning, the way that technology augments human capabilities, everything really goes back to this human machine interface and the ability to be able to provide people with the tools they need to do their jobs effectively. It may be you need less people, or people become more elevated in the roles they play, but it's the impact on the workforce that is really having such a significant and profound, lasting impact.
Yeah, well, I guess obviously, the pandemic had a lot to do with that, right? That accelerated the, return work from home, scenario, which then led to a lot of things. And certainly it's accelerated the whole, progression of digital platforms. And of course, now with AI and cybersecurity considerations, to your point, it's becoming even more significant that companies, think about how they do this, right? And how they invest, right? Oh, interesting. Good. So in terms of cloud adoption, one of the things, Frank, that I have experienced, and I know you have too, is, thinking back, I don't know, maybe 10 years or so, I was involved in a lot of discussions on the transition to cloud, right? And what's happening and what's the migration look like and what's, on-prem and off-prem and, all of those conversations. And it seemed like it was kind of out there, but it was slow to really materialize. And then it just happened. But, and AI, by the way, is similar in terms of a lot of discussions, right? But what's your sense in terms of where are we as it relates to cloud adoption, across varying businesses, whether it's enterprise or SMB, et cetera? What's your sense there?
Yeah, I think that there are interesting parallels between what I was describing earlier with digital transformation and businesses being more thoughtful in how they spend and how they allocate resources. The same can be said with cloud. Now, from my view, I always have to distinguish between public cloud and
Yep.
cloud.
Yep.
I know a lot of what is really referenced when we talk about the migration to cloud is public cloud. But the reality that we live with today and the reality that's going to continue in the future is hybrid.
Yep.
We are living in distributed environments, and the distribution of those environments and the distribution of the workloads running in those environments are based on a number of factors, not the least of which is business performance, cost, customer experience, user experience. There's this need to orchestrate across all of these environments. In the early days, we saw security and compliance as the number one obstacle, the number one barrier. There wasn't enough experience in the market to fully trust claims that were made about security. And that rapidly changed, well, rapidly over the period of a few years, to where security started to become an enabler. If we looked at our research, where we asked for the top inhibitors and top drivers, security has been on the top of both of those lists.
That's interesting.
And it is interesting. Now, there's security, general security, which is how secure is the environment? Is it more secure than the environment I operate and own? And I think the reality is most businesses came to the conclusion, we can't duplicate the security that the hyperscalers have put in place, right? All but the top tier enterprises.
Right. Right.
So yes, they do a better job at security, but then there are nuances there. And you have businesses that say, well, we still want an element of control.
Yep.
And that lack of control inhibited some companies from making that move. There was also cost management and visibility. In the early days, observability and visibility was evolving to where it is today. Now you have observability platforms that can look at networks end to end, regardless of where assets are deployed. But in the beginning, that wasn't there. And I think there's a lag, Frank, between when something is readily available and when end users and businesses accept the fact that they can do this.
Yeah.
It's available. And this is where I think the channel distributors play a huge role as well. It's accelerating that awareness and education.
Yeah, totally. And obviously supporting it. You mentioned hyperscalers, which kind of leads into one of the questions I had for you. Clearly, we understand their role as it relates to the cloud and cloud support, and what they do. But the other piece that's, very, very interesting in our world is their marketplaces and the work that they do through their marketplaces. And there's a lot of folks that look at that and view that as competitive to some of the things that the channel does, and certainly some of the things that, distributors do. Frankly, my opinion is the competitive piece has been kind of overblown over the last couple of years, because what I've been observing, and I'm really interested in your opinion, is the relationship and the co-opetition, if you will, that now exists among the distributors, the solution providers, and the hyperscalers, has actually got to a place where they're coexisting pretty well. At least that's the way it seems. What's your sense? Because I know you do a lot of work in this area.
Yeah, it's been interesting to observe the shift from on the hyperscaler part to being more inclusive of distributors.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's an acknowledgement that when it comes to channel orchestration, when it comes to orchestrating multi-vendor solutions, when it comes to having that expanded reach into, maybe the smaller partners and smaller customers, there's no one better positioned than the distributors. Now, with marketplaces, there's a lot of attention paid to these huge cloud commitments, hundreds of billions of dollars across the three major hyperscalers.
Right.
And the fact that enterprises are able to obtain significant discounts now through a commitment, an early commitment in advance, and then being able to potentially burn down that commitment using third-party services through marketplaces.
Right.
It seems obvious now that it's in place, but it was ingenious at the time that it was done.
Yeah.
Right. I think a lot of we look back at things and say, well, that seems pretty obvious, but it was really AWS who was the catalyst for all this. And of course, learnings from Amazon and so on and so forth. But
Yeah.
It really was the best of Amazon's culture or AWS's culture and approach to launching something new that made it so successful in the beginning.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, first of all, I couldn't have explained better the role that distribution plays and the value that distribution has than you just did.
Well, thank you.
So yeah, I mean, perfect. In fact, don't do it too often, because you'll end up replacing me, and I like what I do.
Yeah, I doubt that, Frank. And
But-
I have to say, my accelerated understanding of the distribution market has come through GTDC because, I've read a lot of your content as well. And it's been only over the last couple of years that we've been collaborating.
Yeah.
I mean, you've been collaborating with IDC longer.
Right. About four now, and you and I a couple of years. But you described it perfectly. But you also, I think, described very well the there is potential conflict, and it's in the area you mentioned. It's in those big enterprise transactions where they're burning down the hours, if you will, that sometimes causes a little bit of conflict, because the question becomes, what value, are the distributors and or the solution providers playing in that solution? And generally there is value, but it tends to be more subtle, and sometimes it's not as, is not as obvious. But I think overall the relationships have evolved to the point where they all recognize the roles and the value that each provides. And that to me is what's critical, right? And they talk to each other. I mean, as you probably know, each of the hyperscalers has have channel organizations, and they got people that are responsible for talking to the channel partners, talking to the distributors, et cetera. And to me, that's the most significant part, because if people are talking to each other and trying to figure out, ways to go to market jointly, it ends up getting solved, most of the time.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other real value for distributors and that distributors bring is this enormous cohort of sellers who aren't really getting the attention in marketplaces that their larger brethren are. If you look at, the most successful companies, whether it's Palo Alto or Cisco or Salesforce or CrowdStrike, Datadog, these companies that do extremely well, they've put a lot of resources into being successful through marketplaces.
Yeah.
And they will tell you, even for a company as large as Salesforce, which is now transacting billions of dollars through AWS Marketplace, it was effort, right, to put something in place to be able to accomplish that. So come down a tier or two, and these are companies now that are going to have to lean on a partner to be able to have the resources necessary to create the awareness, to participate in co-selling and co-marketing efforts. I think all of the things that distributors have done traditionally are still valuable. They're just now done more digitally than they were in the past.
Totally. And that leads to the next discussion I wanted to have with you, which is really significant. I recently read through the IDC Productscape report on distributor platforms. And it was enlightening because, not only did it explain, the value of the platforms, the reason the platforms exist, and some of the advantages, which I'd like to talk to you about, but it also did a pretty good comparison for those distributors that participated in a number of different categories that were very discreet, right? I mean, they weren't, they were not high level. They were very discreet. Can you do this? And I call it red, yellow, green. That wasn't exactly how you did it, but it's close to it. Talk a little bit about that, Frank, from the standpoint of, what is a Productscape report? What goes into it? How do you develop it? And some of the insights maybe that you gleaned from doing it, because I thought it was an excellent piece of work.
Well, thank you very much for saying that. And I think I shared with you before in a conversation, we had originally targeted, I don't know, maybe a dozen or so distributors to participate. And I think in total, the report, there are maybe 6 or 7 companies, and they're the most well-known distributors. So that says something for the amount of investment in building these platforms out. And I think maybe even the readiness. Now, I'm reading into this, and I may be a little provocative here, but I think it says a lot about the readiness of maybe the broader distributor landscape for having these kind of platform-led business models. So the Productscape is a very detailed directory. You're familiar with the IDC MarketScape, which is an assessment, an actual ranked assessment of participants within a certain category. So we go through a very rigorous process that includes a detailed scoring algorithm and methodology. That scoring component is not part of the Productscape. We realized that there needed to be an opportunity to educate the market on maybe an emerging technology or an emerging market that wasn't as mature or mature enough to really start scoring, but just to inform the market of what's out there. So that was the intent of the Productscape. We do plan to follow up with a MarketScape next year because I really think we're going to see rapid acceleration. What I learned and what I came away with from this exercise is traditionally distribution has been either value, you know, broadline or value, right?
Yeah.
And I think what platforms do, they transform this into value at scale. It's always been costly to scale value.
Yep.
You need personnel, you need people, and so with the platform, you're able to instantiate some of that into the platform, which enables you to scale beyond maybe just the largest customers or the most active customers to actually get into new opportunities with companies that maybe not traditionally have not engaged with distributors as often or at all as in
Yep.
the past.
Yep.
So these are feature rich. I understand now after doing this exercise why it takes so long to build one.
Mm.
Right? It's not just the fiscal investment, but the resources required. You know, if you look at we did briefings for all of these companies, and you look at the effort that Ingram or TD Synnex or Westcon or Arrow put into building out their platforms, you understand.
Yeah.
And this, by the way, has to run a traditional business.
Yeah.
But I believe that it's because of the traditional business that these platforms become so valuable. All of that data that the distributors have been collecting over the years, all of that knowledge of the market, all of those relationships. There's something in the platform world, which you're probably familiar with, called network effects.
Mm-hmm.
The way network effects will work in traditional platforms is that the more participants that join the platform, the more value is created for everyone on the platform. And I think that's eventually going to be the case with distributors. As more participants engage with the platform, there is more value in the data that are collected. That data can then be used to create new features, new capabilities, more accurate matching of partners. And that's the other thing. When I think about distributors, I think about connectors, right? Marketplaces aren't really great at connecting.
Mm.
Distributors are great at connecting.
Yeah.
And that connecting, it's just elevated with AI. And AI is not going to operate without data and automation. That requires that underlying platform. So I'm pretty excited about this. But I do believe that many distributors would like it to accelerate a lot faster.
Yeah, I do too, and I do think it is clearly accelerating, and there's been massive investments made. But the one point that you make, I think that's very, very important for people to recognize, is it does require a transformation within the distributor to be able to, effectively deploy and utilize the platforms on behalf of the vendor community and certainly on behalf of their customers, right? And a lot of people, I think, underplay that. And to your point, the fiscal investment, financial investment, people get that. But the transformation internally, where they actually have to put, teams of people on process and procedures, et cetera, I think is underrated right now and not as well understood as it needs to, as it will be. But it's critical because my sense, Frank, is this is the most significant transformation we've seen within the distributor landscape for 15, 20 years. I mean, this is the game changer that will totally change what they do and how they do it. Mm-hmm. And kind of wrapping up here, I have a question for you related to that, and that is, traditionally, distributors have always done an excellent job at providing the services that they provide at scale to a whole host of folks. One of the things that the vendor community has consistently asked for, and I did it when I was a vendor working with distributors, was help me drive sales, help me get insights into what's happening with my customers, with my solution providers, and help me drive sales. My sense, Frank, is that with the evolution of these platforms, the distributors are going to be able to do that going forward. How do you see that? Did that come out of your research, and was that something that you felt like is going to happen?
Yeah, I agree. I think that's the number one reason that sellers choose a partner is to sell more.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things that I think distributors could do better at, and this is only because it hasn't been their traditional role, is when you look at, now I cover mostly ISVs and
Yep.
SaaS providers, right?
Yep. Yep.
Solutions are moving more to a composable state. Applications are moving more to a composable state. And you may think organizations have already migrated everything to SaaS. That's not true. Over a third of companies are still planning to move to SaaS. That move is going to look different. But ISVs and SaaS providers are looking to partner to embed technology.
Yep.
Right. And the hyperscaler and the GSIs or the RSIs are the primary beneficiaries for that. And I think once distributors can actually get involved in the creation of the solution, which they do now, but actually offering some type of embedded capability, then they can work very closely together with the ISV or the partner to go to market. But it's the number one reason that I'm hearing from ISVs and SaaS providers why they choose a strategic partner like this.
Yep.
Can you provide me access to new markets?
Yep. Yep. Absolutely. And that, at the end of the day, that really becomes a major part of the value where, unfortunately, for some of the distributors, a lot of the value that they do provide kind of gets taken for granted. One, because they've been doing it for so long, and two, they have to do it flawlessly because they're working in an environment that has, very tight margins that don't allow for, much error, if any, right? So, well, look, Frank, this has been fabulous. I've learned a lot listening here, and I know our listeners as well. So I want to thank you for taking the time to join us today.
Oh, it was my pleasure, Frank. Thank you for the opportunity.